so far away from you, but I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the El Paso Museum. I want to thank Michael Tomor. I want to thank Adair, and I want to especially thank Arturo Flores. Arturo is a master of PowerPoint. I know nothing about it at all. So I drove him crazy, and he held my hand. And we'll see what happens. And I'm really happy to speak about Tom Lea. But, you know, I have to admit, coming here to El Paso to talk about Tom Lea, where people know him and knew him for many, many years and have been very well acquainted with his art, is a little like bringing coals to Newcastle. Excuse me if I don't know as much as other people in the audience, but I'm still learning about Tom. So I remember really well when I first heard the name Tom Lea, and that's when I was chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and Adair was the chairman of the President's Council on the Arts and the Humanities, and those two entities worked very close together. And I remember when I got in my office shortly after I arrived in Washington, Adair paid me a courtesy call, and we started to talk about many, many things. And then she began to talk about Tom Lea, and very enthusiastically about Tom Lea. And you know, I have to admit, I didn't know who Tom Lea was, but I wasn't going to let Adair know that. I was supposed to know a lot about art, but I didn't want to embarrass myself. And Adair mentioned that one of Tom's paintings was hanging in the Oval Office, and I was fortunate enough to see that a couple of times. And since that day, really, since I started thinking about Tom Lea and looking about him, I've become a big fan. And I'm a member also of Adair's fan club, and with less energy, I have to say. And like Adair, I'm really keen to make Tom better known. I think those people who know Tom and know the circumstances of his life and the great talent he was really feel a need to communicate their enthusiasm to not only people they know, but to the national audience. So I hope that will happen. So why am I so enthusiastic about Tom Lea, and why is Adair so enthusiastic about Tom Lea? Well, as many of you know, he was a brilliant painter of landscapes, of portraits, of mountains, and even cows. He did a whole series of cattle paintings, which are amazing. And I wanted to show you a painting that I'm going to start, which is just around the corner here. This landscape. He was a superb illustrator. He illustrated many, many books. A formidable writer of history and novels and diaries and screenplays, and had a little bit of movie acting experience. He was a war artist. He was a chronicler of the Southwest, and he was a patriot. You know, artists are sometimes, mainly they're endowed with one talent. They could paint, they could carve, they can etch. But not many artists have all those talents. In fact, I've been thinking about it, who else could do all those things? And I can't think of many. Peter Paul Rubens was one. He was a superb painter, diplomat, courtier, and the like, but very few. So the combination of all these talents in one person is really unusual. So, okay, if Tom is so great, why doesn't he have a national reputation? I mean, why doesn't everybody know about him? How come I didn't know about him? When Adair visited me those years ago in Washington, and you know, there are people who are called regional artists like Thomas Hart Benton or Grant Wood are associated with specific locations, and they're well known. But part of this is most of it is Tom Lea's own making. Now, from everything I know about him, he was a very modest man who did not, unlike almost every other artist I've studied, seek a national reputation. He didn't want it. As far as I know, he never had a New York gallery. And that's the absolute essential for artists looking to make a national reputation. Nor, interesting enough, did he seek one. Almost every artist I know, and many artists in the past, had a New York gallery. He stuck to his last, painting and illustrating for the most part what he knew and what he loved. And that, I think, is a part of his art, central part of his art, which makes it so interesting and so inspiring. He also painted pictures that people can understand immediately, like this one. Pictures with figurative subjects or recognizable landscape, which express emotions that are universally shared by all of us. So unlike Jackson Pollock, let's say, or Mark Rothko, for example, whose art did not tap into kind of collective connotations. When we look at a Rothko or look at Jackson Pollock, we all think different things. There's nothing communal that holds us together. And Tom's art wasn't like that. It's meant to unite us instead of isolating us in our own psychological silos. So he put some of this into a lecture he gave in 1992. Let's see a little sample of what his writing was like. So he says, as a painter today, I am generally unknown, either by artists or by the laity. And there he's talking to his other artists, anywhere outside limited areas of the Southwest. I live remote from groups, from associations, from schools, from colonies, even from any colleague, totally apart from the latest movement, any recent trend, and any colleague. Any market, any current fashion, any market stir in what is termed, and these are all capitals, the art world, here and abroad. For 50 years I have not sought the approval of a critic, the interest of a dealer, the approbation of a museum director. Sorry, Michael. Another obvious reason why my work is not known in any in crowd or any in place. I mean, the way he writes this, the rhythms, the words, the forcefulness of those sentences is really, really remarkable. It shows you some idea of what a really excellent writer he was. So when he has a disdain for the contemporary art world, which really grew up as he did, and when he wrote those words was pretty much dominated by non-figurative, abstract, expressionist art. He also says, I feel good working as a painter all by myself. I feel clean, he says. No contact with, no sympathy for the arcane, pseudo-aesthetical acrobatics of the doodlers, diddlers, today vandalizing the majestic art of painting. So he had strong opinions. So Tom's self-imposed isolation in his painting style, which is traditional, but it's not without influence. I mean, if you look at Tom's work carefully, you can see there's influence from older art, Paradel Francesca, for instance, Hopper, Chirico, Georgia O'Keeffe, and many, many other people who were painting as he did. He always was himself. He never let another ism or another style take over. But he was not just working in complete isolation. He was really looking at other people, as you'll see as I go on with this talk. And so he said, okay, I don't want anything to do with the art world, leave me alone. And the art world, as he dubbed it, has responded in kind by ignoring his work or calling it mere illustration. So Rockwell, who's the excellent Rockwell show here, Norman Rockwell suffered that same fate for years until a new generation realized that he too, in a very different way than Tom, was an artist worthy of note, and not just an illustrator, as he had been called very derogatorily up until recently. Just not somebody who did pretty, sappy Saturday Evening Post covers, but as an artist who evoked traditional American tenets and values, and through the great tradition of figurative art. And there is just an enormous amount of enthusiasm for Norman Rockwell. So I think now it's Tom's turn to be not rediscovered, but discovered by the nation that he so loved and he so served so well. And there I have to congratulate Adair and the Tom Lea Institute. And Mac Greeley, who wrote really the definitive book about Tom Lea's war art, which I'm going to talk about, for this really noble effort to make Tom much better known, called The 2,000-Yard Stare, has recounted Tom's wartime experience and his travels. He's collected a good deal of his war diary, and it really extensively illustrated this beautiful book with Tom's sketches and his paintings. And that's going to remain the definitive study on this part of Tom's career. And so I can add very, very little to that. The only thing I can do is add some observation about the artistic nature of what Tom did during the war. So he was part of Life magazine's small group of war artists, which Don Longwell, who was the magazine's editor, commissioned to record almost every aspect of the war. And Longwell and his art editor felt, and I think rightly so, that artists as well as writers and photographers needed to cover the war. And that turns out to have been a very wise decision, because painting or drawing is not about the immediate, but like a photograph, but represents a really prolonged meditation on the subject, which is passed through the creative and physical process of making art. And that can render a deeper and more lasting and more meaningful image than a photograph. You know, of course, Life's artists were not the first to record war. It's a very old tradition dating back to almost prehistoric times, to the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans, all who represented armed struggle, sometimes in really the most graphic way imaginable. And that's true in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance. If you know Paolo battle scenes, you'll recognize what I'm talking about. And the whole subsequent history of Western art, and a lot of non-Western art as well. It's interesting because the depiction of warfare, of course, is as old as art itself. It says something about the nature of our society. And you know, up to the middle of the 19th century, there were a lot of artists who specialized in war scenes, and they made their living by painting battles and heroes and the like. But in that century, there was a major turning point, and that was with Goya's works, which many of you may know, called The Disasters of War, which were published between 1810 and 1820. And in these, Goya showed, in this really brilliant series of prints, that war wasn't heroic. It wasn't just about great generals or brave deeds, but it was bloody, and it was brutal, and some of these images that he did are really hard to look at even today. And it involved not only soldiers, but hapless civilians as well. So that was a major turning point in the depiction of war. But soon after, Goya's century or so after Goya's paintings, the artists and the need for artists to paint more rapidly declined because of the discovery of photography, and mainly its use in the American Civil War. And I'm sure that all of you have seen these photographs by Matthew Brady of Lincoln and Antietam, portraits of the gaunt Lincoln or of the dead at Gettysburg. And that allowed people, Brady's contemporaries, to see war in an entirely different way. And that's how we still conjure up the Civil War. When we think about the Civil War, we don't really think about words. We think about those photographers like Brady's photographs. And we see the real horror of war, you know, the ruins of Richmond or the bloated corpses at Gettysburg, and so forth. You know, it's really hard. Photographs about history make a real turning point because it's much harder, I found, to get people interested in history before photography. We're so used to seeing photography and the realism of photography that it's much easier to talk about the Civil War in the period going forward than it is back where they're just illustrated by artists. So there were artists on the front line long after the Civil War, but really the idea of painting or carving images of art had really declined. And that's why Longwell's decision to employ Tom and Tom's fellow artists is really surprising. These great, brilliant photographs of Life magazine. And once Tom asked Longwell why he had commissioned a landlocked Texan, and Longwell told him, he told Tom, "You think I wanted any small boat sailor, any confirmed fancier of the ocean deep, any amateur naval authority showing off what he already knew? I wanted a fresh eye, and I got one." And that certainly is true. So Tom's travels during the war were exhaustive. He visited 4 continents and many countries, among them Greenland, Iceland, England, Algeria, Egypt, Iran, India, China, Brazil, and Italy. He traveled thousands of miles through the air on B-17s and C-47s and B-54s, and on the sea in the USS Hornet, the USS Ormsby, and the USS William Ward Burroughs. He loved ships. And he talks about all these as though they had their own personality. And as he bumped along in these Air Force planes or rode the waves in a carrier, or landed on Peleliu, this horrifying battle, or just cooled his heels in some godforsaken place, he sketched and he wrote and he observed and made entries in his war diary, which is reproduced in MacNicol's book, well worth reading. And these entries were hastily composed under really strained circumstances, but they're all miniature masterpieces. And I said he's a really gifted writer, and he thought with clarity and wrote with grace, and lots of times with a touch of humor. But above all, he thought and he wrote like an artist. And for example, his description of the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, he says, I'll just go back to Tom. So this is what he says about the Isle of Lewis in Scotland. On the rare sunshiny afternoon, this outer Scottish island was like something from a picture book, with surf lapping at the miniature cliffs topped by velvety green, treeless moors. On the moors, surrounded by hedges or neat stone walls, were white plastered houses with steep roofs of dark slate, and chimney pots at both ends. They were white sheep with black noses gazing on the velvety green, and white gulls in the blue sky. And everywhere there was a salty smell of the sea. Think about it. Velvety green, moors, blue sky, white sheep, dark slate. Like all good artists, Tom thinks in color and shape. Or this description of a base in Greenland. When a high wind comes down the chasm, it really howls. The wind started last night and has blown the sky clean and brilliant. The sun shines with a silvery brightness on the craggy mountains, and shadows, both near and far, are of normal blue from cobalt to ultramarine. Thinking about the 17th century French artists, when people are trying to kill you, is pretty remarkable. And the diaries and Tom's writing on the war when he returned periodically to El Paso to work up paintings for life from his notes and sketches are also filled with acute, highly personal observations on the men and women and places he saw, and the thousands of miles, and what he saw in the thousands of miles he traveled. And he was very curious. Everywhere we see his curiosity coming through. And his friendship towards people he met, which was reciprocated towards him. He liked people and people liked him. And when we turn to his pictorial art, we see many of the same qualities that are embodied in his writings. Let's have a look at some of the portraits, warscapes, and combat scenes. From the window of a plane at 6,000 feet, from the scores of places he visited, and the hundreds of folks he met along the way. Many of these sketches are really back of the envelope, bare outlines in pencil of what he could record rapidly. And this is one of them. He was on the Hornet, the carrier Hornet, when he saw the sinking by a Japanese submarine of the USS Wasp. And you could see what he does. He describes making this sketch it's like a back of the envelope sketch of the Wasp being hit. And he makes all these color notations along with, and then he turned it into this terrific painting of the Wasp. And one of the great things that's happened in the last couple of days is that, was it the day before yesterday, Adair? Yeah. We went out to the U.S. Military History Center and saw all the Tom Lees that he had done for Life magazine. Because Life donated them to the Department of Defense, and now they're part of the Army's collection, including this one. And he would, as I said, he returned to life, and he'd make these paintings and make sketches for publication. How he did that, and the necessities of getting that ready for publication, are a really interesting problem. It's probably worth looking into. And so here's one of his portraits. Oh, well, I wanted to show you, this is another one of these color notations. Here's a portrait of Lieutenant Colonel Jet MacNicol, who was a P-38 pilot that Tom drew at an air base in North Africa. Here's how he describes it. I made a portrait sketch of Jet in a silly Scotch tweed cap that he wears to his plane when he goes out to fly a mission. Jet says, "I'm not proud of my superstition, but there it is." So he always had to wear that cap. And you can see how much detail he's lavished on the cap, sort of an ascending level of detail from the uniform to the face to the cap. It's fortunate we have this, a very precious record, because Jet was one of the many servicemen who flew out and never came back. And aside from the many drawings he knew of people he knew and he admired, he made a lot of formal portraits depicting major commanders of the war, most of whom we did not know. It's a kind of different idea. He knew these people, he could spend time with them like Jet and do these very intimate portraits. But there are people that he didn't know. And a good example of this is Tom's most accomplished. And one of Tom's most accomplished portraits, made while he was in China, with the famous Flying Tigers, is the leader of that outfit, General Claire Chennault, who gave the artist a sitting on 14th November 1943. What a face. Tom describes the experience. He reminded me of a fierce hawk. His head is covered with skin like dry old leather. His black hair is tousled, and his tough, sharp eyes, which are dark brown, cut into you. His thin-lipped mouth is like... So no description from me can match that word portrait which Tom gives of this weather-beaten, lantern-jawed warrior, and whose curiosity and forcefulness is rendered by the subtle gradations of Tom's ink drawing. This incredibly subtle way. It shows the tremendous skill that Tom had with all materials that he used. And his ability to translate these thoughts into such images of this stunning portrait is really, it's nothing short of amazing. But 4 days before he made this Chennault portrait, Tom got a great opportunity. He had worked very hard for it. He had cooled his heels waiting to get it. And that was an audience with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the Chinese, and later he engaged in a titanic struggle with Mao Zedong, ultimately fleeing, leaving the country. But this finished portrait is one of I think Tom's finest is the tour de force of this volumetric rendering of the head, and the forehead, and the close-shaven skull, and the textures. Really amazing with the skin, and the mustache, and the stubble on his head. And the graduated coloring are really extraordinary. And this portrait in one of Madame Chiang Kai-shek is also remarkable in its physicality, but also in its character as well. Now, it's really interesting. These portraits were never published. In his war art, Tom keeps returning to nature. He left, which he never left, ever. One of the enduring themes of his art. But now there's a new element to what he depicted. War. And I don't think landscape is quite the right word for these works, so I've chosen to call them warscapes. Here's one of them. P-47's climb over Steeple Morton. It's a really good example of what I'm talking about. Green on dimming green, the soft ridges of England fade into the blue, misty distances under a sky forever changing with moving, growing, dissolving clouds. There is an opalescent sky, which is harder and more stable. Here all is change, in fleeting half-light, full light, and shadows. I look out toward the distant ridges from my window, seeing the church spire of a far-off village, the trees, the hedges, the green fields, and yellow haystacks. And I feel that I understand better now the English painters, and especially Constable, who might have created the landscape out my window. Here again he sees with the painter's eye. Notice he doesn't say that the landscape looks like a Constable, but that looks like it was created by Constable. And Tom's luminous atmospheric landscape with its moving, misty sky is a near-perfect translation of the word picture he paints from his window, and a great homage to Constable himself, who Tom knew, and you can see this in so many of his landscapes and his cloudscapes. But this is not the idyllic world of the 19th century, but this is a scene of drama and danger, which is juxtaposed now, or interposed to this painting. The sky is filled with P-47 fighter planes forming up to escort B-17s, making a bombing run over Europe, a dangerous and often fatal task. Many of these planes, fighters and bombers, never came back. Tom explains it well. They took off in roaring pairs like some abstract geometrical theorem of war in perfect formation. They circled the field once and headed out to the northeast. But some of Tom's works, most interesting and novel works, they're not like this Steeple Morton landscape. They're not earthbound, but they depict the world from overhead, from the window of a plane, which he was flying in, high above the earth. And I don't know if Tom was the first to paint these aerial landscapes or aerialscapes, but he certainly was one of the first, and in many ways, I think one of the most novel. This is a very small sketch. It's one of the most dramatic of all these aerialscapes. He first saw this island when he was making his way home on his last flight back to El Paso to paint his last pictures for life. But during the war, it was one of the busiest airfields. It held one of the busiest airfields in the world, and because it was used as a refueling and repair stop on the transatlantic hop from the United States to the Pacific Theater. I guess that airfield, a little research on it, I guess that airfield is completely gone now. Tom called it harsh and barren with a complete desolation, and yet what a place to spend the war. In Tom's painting, we can see that jagged island with its cloud-shrouded crest far below, set in that vast sea. The plain silhouetted wing appears in the top half of the painting. This is Tom's point of view from the window of the plane, in which he was observing Ascension Island as they were circling to make a landing. And it really captures the isolation and the bleakness of this island in a way that really is impossible to capture with a photograph. And it is striking, really, in its breadth and originality. And like so many works, I don't have time to talk about this, that Tom did, really unconventional in its composition. He's really a very original composer with viewpoints and angles of all the work that he did. Now, Tom's last assignment for life was a matter of life and death, literally. He was one of the very few, I think 3, reporters to land with the Marines in the first assault wave on Peleliu, a minuscule island in the Pacific southwest of the Philippines. And there he is on Peleliu, 30-something years old. And this battle was supposed to be over in 3 or 4 days. And as they were hopping island by island, next to Iwo Jima and then onward to establish bases to bomb and then eventually to invade Japan, which was all negated by the fact that the bomb was dropped. So this battle was one of the most savage of the entire Second World War. It was the highest casualty rate in the Pacific. There were over 10,000 casualties on this tiny island. It was supposed to be a quick victory. That was not the case, as the Japanese, really fanatical Japanese resistance was dug deeply into the hard coral of the islands. There was a whole interlocking network of caves and tunnels in this very hard coral, and the Japanese did not give up. And there was much hand-to-hand combat. It was one of the, as I say, one of the most ferocious and awful battles of the war. There's still a debate about whether it was actually necessary to take Peleliu, whether, like many other of these islands, it could be bypassed. But that's for military historians, not me. Now, landing on that day with Tom was a young Marine named Eugene Sledge, who wrote this amazing book, With the Old Breed in Peleliu and Okinawa, describing his, he was in college, he joined the Marines, went to basic training, then landed on Peleliu, rested, and then landed on Okinawa. These basic, awful battles. This book, With the Old Breed in Peleliu and Okinawa, has been called one of the finest narratives by a combat soldier ever written. And I recommend it. I mean, it's not an easy book to read, but like Tom, Eugene Sledge is a wonderful writer. And he's kind of been revived recently. He was figured in the Pacific that was on, I think, HBO. And when we went to the Marine Corps Museum, there's a whole section on the old Eugene Sledge talking about his experience in the war. If you ever get there, it's really worth seeing. So I recommend it along with Tom's writing, which is of that level. Tom never met Sledge. They landed together on different beaches, but on the same first wave of invasion, the Marine hitting the beach. They never met each other. And I just found out recently that, well, they never met. Eugene Sledge's parents sent Tom's life reporting, some articles from Tom's reporting in life to Eugene Sledge when he was still in the Marines. Here's Sledge's description of the landing on Peleliu. We moved ahead, watching the frightful spectacle. Huge geysers of waters rose around the Amtrak, that's their landing vehicles, ahead of us as they approached the reef. The beach was now marked along its length by a continuous sheet of flame, backed by a thick wall of smoke. It seemed as though a huge volcano had erupted from the sea, and rather than heading for an island, were we being drawn into the vortex of a flaming abyss. For many, it was to be oblivion. And the sledge's view, and that of the thousands of others headed for that beach, many never to return. That inferno was brilliantly captured in one of Tom's most famous paintings, Going In. Tom describes the scene. Over the gunwale of a craft abreast of us, I saw a Marine, his face painted for the jungle, his eyes set for the beach, his mouth set for murder, his big hands quiet now in the last moments before the tough tendons drew up to kill. It seemed as though a huge volcano had erupted from the sea. That Tom volunteered for this assignment is really a testimony to his courage and his devotion to the mission, which he captured in an unforgettable painting depicting the true horror of the landing. It's called The Price. And it illustrates something that Tom showed shortly after he left his landing craft. He says, lying there in terror, looking longingly up at the slope to better cover, I saw a wounded man near me staggering. His face was a half bloody pulp, and the mangled shreds of what was his left arm hung down like a stick as he bent over his tumbling, shock-crazy walk. The half of his face that was still human held the most terrifying look of abject patience, fear of a Marine who'd been through the hell of Peleliu. As Tom said, his mind had crumbled in battle, his jaw hung, and his eyes were like two black, empty holes. I don't think there's ever been a better depiction of shell shock. And it's very interesting. He just doesn't show the Marine, he shows this artillery piece, mobile artillery piece. And then these curious details, the fighter planes, the spotter plane above, this bloody nose ridge, which they had to capture. And then over just behind the Marines, right shoulder to your left, you see two Marines looking at a samurai sword that they captured. So he packs a lot of things into this. After Peleliu, the war was over for Tom, and his long travels were at last finished. Now his thoughts and his brushes could return to the places and people he loved. Most particularly to his wife, Sarah, who had so occupied his mind when he was away and in danger. Maybe after all the mayhem and death he saw at Peleliu, he remembered a mystical fresco by Piero della Francesca he had seen in Italy long ago, the resurrection. It was this memory, that inspired his Sarah in summertime, a luminous image of calm and beauty, and perhaps Tom's own resurrection.